Okay, I think yeah, I think most of the people in the waiting room, yeah, okay, I think the waiting room is cleared. Good morning. Maybe I should say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. For those of us in the East Asia, Southeast Asia region, we are, good morning to everybody. Thank you so much for taking this time to come and join us. Good morning, Phyllis, Vincent. Hey, very good to see everybody. So welcome to the second day of the International Symposium on Service Learning and Responsible Global Citizenship. I am Grace Ngai. I am the head of the Service Learning and Leadership Office here at Hong Kong Polytechnic University. So for participants who were here yesterday, we really hope that you enjoyed the talks, the workshops, and the virtual world. I went in there several times and it was like a massive online party, and we had exhibitors sending out mass appeals like, hey, come and check out this booth here, whatever, or the posters, and that's and okay, they need to get votes because we are going to be giving out People's Choice Awards to the most popular posters at the secondary school and the university level for the students as an encouragement. So they had some incentive, but it was still a lot of fun. So basically, if you haven't had the chance to take a look at the virtual world yet, please do so. Not right now, okay? We want you here for the keynote. But do that after the keynote. It gives a immersive experience of three of our flagship projects, our international service learning in Rwanda, assistive technology for disabled children, and art therapy through fashion co-creation for recovering mentally ill patients, as well as a lot of other smaller exhibits. So there are a lot of multimedia exhibits on there. We have 185 interactable objects to be exact. So anyway, I shouldn't keep on tangenting off. Back to the topic. Without further ado, we will move to the first talk of today. Our speaker is Dr. Luke Terra of Stanford University. I imagine everybody knows what Stanford is, and Dr. Terra is the Director of Community Engaged Learning and Research and Associate Director of the Haas Center for Public Service at Stanford University. What this means is that Dr. Terra leads the university's community engaged learning and research effort. Now, for those of us who are familiar with the service learning scene in the US, we know that Stanford has a amazing civic engagement program. They call it Cardinal Service. They serve at many different levels: student learning, faculty research, student research, and public service, right? And Dr. Terra's portfolio includes faculty training and support, community partnership development, community-based research course design and support, and graduate student training and mentorship. So that's like a lot of things in there. And prior to Stanford, Dr. Terra was at Colorado College, where he was assistant director of the Center for Service and Learning, and he managed international civic education programs at the Center for Civic Education. So hence, he's very familiar with the international learning scene, including international service learning, study abroad, comparative education, and so on. And this actually dovetails very neatly with his research interests, which are also very international. His doctorate is in international comparative education and history of education, which he got at the Stanford Graduate School of Education. And his research interests are very interesting: history and civic education in post-conflict settings such as Northern Ireland, and comparative studies of education policy and social studies curricula. And in 2018, he co-edited a volume on teaching and learning: the difficult past, comparative perspectives. And Dr. Terra is also very active in the service learning community. So if you go into the virtual world, as I hope all of you will do later, you'll see a book with IR slides on it. IR slides, IARSLCE. And that stands for the International Association for Research on Community Learning and Community Engagement, on Service Learning and Community Engagement, sorry. And it is the community for service learning research. And they are our partners for this event. And Dr. Terra is one of the board members. So, And in addition, Dr. Terra is a former secondary teacher. He has taught US and world history in public and public charter schools in Colorado. So he's very qualified to speak on our topic for this session, which is service learning as a high impact practice to enhance academic learning in K-12 classrooms. Now, this is very relevant for us, even those of us who are in university, because too often we in university think that we are the center of the world. Everything is about university education, university research, right? But of course, we couldn't do what we are doing, and we wouldn't have our students and our teachers without the K-12 education sector. Right. So that actually makes today's talk even more important. And my understanding is that there are members in the participants who are from the K-12 sector, and you are very important. Without your efforts, we couldn't do what we want to do. So without further ado, I'll give the time to Dr. Terra. Now, since we have a fairly big audience today, we are going to use some technology to help us to manage our questions. So in the chat box coming up, and also down here, am I pointing correctly? Yeah, down here, there is a link to the Poll Everywhere platform. So please put your questions on there, and you can also upvote and downvote the questions. And we are going to be picking questions out of the platform for Dr. Terra after the talk. So if you have a question, please make sure that it's on there. Otherwise, I won't see it. Okay, so thank you very much. Without further ado, Luke, it's yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you for that introduction, Grace. If it's all right, I'm going to put you in touch with my mother-in-law so that you can explain to her what I do, because every time I go to visit her, I have to try to do it again. And your summary was way better than I can ever do when I talk with her. So I'm going to try to take notes. It's really a wonderful pleasure to be with all of you this evening for me, morning and afternoon for you. I'm joining you from Colorado, where I am visiting some family. So it's really nice to be back in the mountains for a little bit. And I want to just thank you all for joining the conversation. I'm sorry we can't be together in person, but I am glad that technology allows us to connect like this virtually. And I've had an opportunity to engage with folks in this network a few times now, and I'm starting to see some familiar names and faces, which is a real joy for me. So thank you. I hope all of your families and friends are healthy and safe, along with the students that you serve. And I also want to particularly thank Grace and Nancy and Stephen and the whole team at the Service Learning and Leadership Office at Hong Kong Polytechnic University for hosting this wonderful conference and inviting me to participate. I'm very grateful for their leadership in supporting a growing network of service learning practitioners throughout the region and the world in sessions like this. So thank you so much for your warm hospitality. As Grace mentioned, my name is Luke Terra, and I serve as the Director of Community Engaged Learning and Research at the Haas Center. I won't share anything else because Grace did it so beautifully. Our topic today, as she mentioned, was on service learning in K-12. And exactly as Grace said, I was so excited for this topic because I completely agree that I think often in higher ed, we can be a little bit inward looking, a little insular, and not really think about how the work that we want to encourage at the higher ed level translates and applies with our K-12 colleagues. And that's important for a couple of reasons. One, as Grace said, that those K-12 students hit our classrooms, and those teachers are often trained in our universities. And also, second, because the work that we do with our students in higher ed often is with and in partnership with our K-12 colleagues. So K-12 settings, primary schools, secondary schools are often sites for service learning for us. And so it makes sense for us to be thinking more broadly about how what service learning looks like and the different kinds of ways that we can partner with our K-12 colleagues in this work. And so I hope that, and I think on the call we have folks who are classroom teachers in K-12, and welcome and thank you so much for being here. I think we probably have some school administrators and school leaders, and I know we have a number of higher ed colleagues, and I hope that this presentation, while K-12 focused, will feel applicable to everyone. So specifically some goals for our short time together. One, just want to identify some different approaches to and best practices of service learning and community engagement, make sure that we all have a common foundation in that. Consider a few models from lower, middle, and high schools, and then think about how those apply to your context. And then answer a few key design considerations as you deepen service learning in whatever setting that you're in. So first, some context. And again, as Grace mentioned, I wanted to just share a bit about kind of where I come into this topic. My current work is in higher ed, and I focus mainly on work with faculty, helping them to integrate service learning into their courses. But I previously was a K-12 teacher and continued to work even in my doctoral program in the Stanford Teacher Education Program, teaching the curriculum and instruction courses for our teacher candidates. I've worked with apprentice teachers, helping to give lesson observations and feedback, and teaching trainings in backwards design and other kinds of curriculum development. So I've tried to sort of keep a foot in that door, which is why it was so great to think about putting together this workshop specifically focused on it. At Stanford, in addition to leading the team that's really focused on service learning at Stanford, I've also had a chance to teach service learning courses. So have some experiences, both someone who supports and helps do the kind of matchmaking with partners, but also as a practitioner in the classroom. And just quick context about the Haas Center. We were established in 1985. In terms of our kind of staffing model, we have 6 full-time directors of community engaged learning on my team who focus on supporting faculty in these different areas: education, health, environment, engineering, urban studies, and the arts. Collectively, we support a little bit more than 150 community engaged courses each year in 55 different departments and programs. Okay, recognizing that we have folks coming in from kind of different levels of experience, and I want to be sensitive to folks who may be just trying to sort of think about what this looks like in their own classroom. Here's 2 quick definitions of service learning, a long one and a short one, so you can kind of pick which one you prefer. So Eiler and Giles describe service learning as a form of experiential learning, where learning occurs through a cycle of action and reflection as students seek to achieve real objectives for the community and deeper understanding and skills for themselves. Or more simply, service learning is a teaching and learning strategy that integrates community service with an academic curriculum. Also important to sort of differentiate between what service learning is and what it isn't. So when we talk about service learning, we really mean service experiences that are tied to academic learning with preparation, opportunities for reflection, and meaning making for students. But there's lots of other service activities that we engage our students in, both in the higher ed sector, where many of us work, but also in K-12. And all of those are valuable components of a holistic approach to service within our schools. For the purpose of this conversation, we're going to be focused a little bit more narrowly on the service learning piece, but I want to just recognize that there's lots of forms that service takes. All of them can be to the good, and service learning is just one specific kind of form of it. So a few examples of how service might show up in a non-service learning way. Students who do volunteering or direct service. So maybe they tutor once a week in the afternoons in a local elementary school, or maybe they do a fundraising canned food drive for a homeless shelter, or any other service experience that doesn't tie back to a structured learning experience. Those are all really great to have, and I hope that they are a part of a portfolio of experiences that students have at your institution. We're just going to focus a little bit on just this one chunk of service learning where it is tied to the academic curriculum. And Heffernan describes these 6 models of service learning, and I think this is helpful to just help us think broadly about how it shows up. So in terms of service learning, the first model that she describes as pure service learning, and by that she just means a course where the whole sort of point of the course is to engage students in a service activity that then structures both learning and reflection around that. So often this shows up kind of in an elective class, for example, where you're teaching a course on, say, homelessness, and there's a service engagement and students are learning about it while doing it. Second is a discipline-based service learning course. So that's a service learning course that embeds service in a core academic course. Languages, history, social science, math, a course that all students take that's a traditional academic course, but embedded in that is a service component. Third are problem-based service learning courses. You could also think of them as project-based, where we engage students in a project that is by its nature interdisciplinary, because most real projects don't come in one neat disciplinary bucket. And so projects can be a really good way of engaging students in sort of broader interdisciplinary thinking about the particular skills that they're developing. Capstone courses, we're more familiar with these, I think, at the higher ed level, where we're engaging students, say, in the last year of their major, in that sort of academic synthesis experience. Sometimes we call those capstones, where they're trying to apply all of the learning they've done in, say, their engineering major and showcase that in one project. And there are really powerful ways of doing that in a service context. Service internships, we're all very familiar with internships and how that works. One just note here, in order for a service internship to be a model of service learning, there needs to be a structured way of for students to both prepare for, understand, make meaning of, reflect on that experience while they're having it. So just sending students out to have an experience in a setting in itself is not a service learning experience, but if we create some scaffolding around that to support their learning and growth and development, then that would sort of fit as a model of service learning. And then lastly, community-based research, which is leveraging research training to answer questions that communities identify, research questions that our community partners identify, and structuring that in a learning experience for students. So just to help you think kind of creatively about what this might look like. In the title of the talk, I described service learning as a high impact practice. I'm sorry about that. How long have I been muted? I don't know how that happened. I apologize. Am I back? Okay, sorry. Well, let me know if I need to backtrack, but I'll just keep going. So in the title of the talk, we describe service learning as a high impact practice. And that's derived from a 2008 report from the American Association of Colleges and Universities that identified 10 practices, in this case in the context of higher ed, that had consistently showed strong evidence of effectiveness in terms of retention, engagement, and student learning. And service learning was lifted up as one of those 10 practices. And though the report itself focused on higher ed and empirical work from higher ed, I think there is still a robust body of evidence around K-12 that shows the same outcome. And I wanted to lift that up because sometimes some of us in the K-12 setting need to be able to justify service learning, not for its civic purpose, sort of developing students as sort of thoughtful citizens, but for its academic merits. We need to be able to defend service learning as really a strategy, a pedagogy that actually leads to deeper and better and more complete academic learning, not just improved kind of character or sense of sort of the world and our place in it. And so for those of us if we're in an institution where we need to make that kind of an argument, I just wanted to lift up that there's a really strong body of evidence to be able to bring to that, and happy to talk more about that. I also just want to note that in addition to service learning, really all the five impact practices that you see there on the right really are relevant to us. So it's not, I think it's important to think of service learning as a pedagogy that can be incorporated into a range of these high impact practices. So when we think about service learning, there's a few best practices that really transcend all grade levels. So this is as relevant in first grade as it is in graduate school. Service learning, when it's high quality and done well, does a few things. First, it integrates academic learning with service. Second, it addresses a community identified need or priority. Third, it produces reciprocal benefits for students and partners, so mutual benefits. Fourth, it adequately prepares students with the knowledge and skills needed to contribute. And lastly, it provides opportunities for reflection, not just at the end, but before, during, and after the experience. And as I mentioned, there are sort of consistent programming types, sort of ways that this shows up in our schools. And we've talked about a number of these. The only ones we haven't talked about that I know do happen in I think for some of you, one, service days and service weeks. So sometimes that's a very efficient way to engage students. So we may take a week and do an immersive experience. And then the last one, international service learning trips, which I know are much more accessible for many of you than they are for us in a place where it can take quite some distance to get outside of the country. But for some of you, that's as easy as going a few miles. So I know that's a much more common thing in many of your schools. Okay, so I wanted to just set some common foundations so that we're all kind of thinking about this from a similar framework. Now I'd like to share a little bit about what this looks like specifically in the K-12 sector, because while there are many similarities in service learning across all grades, service learning does take some different forms and needs to respond to some different constraints in K-12. Before we dive into that though, just a couple additional caveats. One, the K-12 sector itself includes young people across a very wide developmental range. We could spend our hour just talking about how to structure service learning in elementary school, and that would take it all of our time. So even just taking a K-12 frame is going to require us to sort of, I think, zoom out a little bit. Second, I want to just own that my perspective here is going to be fairly US based. While while some of my scholarly work is international in focus, my experience working with elementary, middle, and high schools is pretty US focused. And so the examples that I'm going to draw from are going to come from a US context. I hope that they will translate well and still offer some helpful guidance for you in whatever setting that you're in. And then lastly, again, just want to acknowledge, I know there are higher ed colleagues on the call, and we'll welcome when we get to the Q&A questions around post-secondary models. It is not hard to get me talking about, things that we do at Stanford or things that our colleagues do in higher ed. So if that's something that you came to learn about, please don't hesitate to add those questions as well. Okay, so in terms of design considerations for K-12, there's kind of two things I thought we might do. First, to talk about some curricular models. And to do that, I want to draw from a landscape analysis that some colleagues and I did last year. And this was really designed to provide a report for a particular school that I've been involved in supporting some of their teachers, the Nueva School here in the Bay Area. And as they were trying to develop and thinking about what a robust service learning program would look like, they wanted to get a sense for what some of their peer institutions around the country did. And so we did a kind of a 3 or 4 month landscape analysis of 12 independent or private schools across the country to say, among the leading independent schools, what are the kinds of models that they've developed at lower, middle, and high school? And I thought for the purposes of this talk, that might be a helpful kind of set of data to get our thinking going about the different ways that this might look. So I'm going to draw from that. And I just want to acknowledge Tammy Crown and the Community Service Learning Task Force and all the great work that they did to pull some of this data together that I'll be sharing. And then I want to pivot to thinking about how you would approach this in your context. Sort of what are the takeaways from this? And to do that, I want to kind of frame 3 sort of user types. And I hope that one of these will feel close enough to you that you can kind of hold on to it. So I think we have some classroom teachers in the room. And so I want to think about sort of what does this look like at the level of a classroom? I think we have some administrators and teaching teams who are kind of thinking about this at the level of a school. And then lastly, our university partners. So I want to try to add some questions at the end to help you think about sort of where could you go depending on sort of where you're coming into this conversation. Also, just a clarification in the US, kind of here's how we divide lower, middle, high. This I'm sure is familiar to most of you, but just to make sure. So when I describe lower school models, that's generally pre-kindergarten, which is age 4 through grade 5, can be grade 6, but pre-K grade 5 is pretty common, and that's about at age 10. Middle school is generally grade 6 through grade 8 or age 11 to 13, 14. And then high school is pretty consistently grade 9 through 12, age 14 to 18. So just to give you a sense of kind of what models I'm referring to. Okay. So as I mentioned, this data is drawn from interviews with staff at 12 independent or private schools in the Bay Area and New York. Why independent or private schools? So most students in the US are enrolled in public schools. Public schools, though, and I'm sure some of this may be familiar to you, are much more structured and regimented when it comes to the curriculum and how they can operate. So they have less flexibility when it comes to things like service learning. Many amazing models still happen because teachers are incredibly innovative within the constraints that they have. But we focused on independent or private schools because they have more flexibility to develop innovative models without some of the constraints that public schools have. So we just thought we would see some kind of more variation in the kinds of approaches that they took, and that would be more helpful for us as we were trying to make recommendations to the Nueva School. So for the lower schools, we saw 3 main models, and I'm going to just read them, but then I'll describe them in much more detail in a moment. The first was one division-wide partnership. So in a pre-K 4 or pre-K 5 school, they had one community partner that everyone was involved in. A second model was to have grade-level partnerships organized outside of the academic curriculum. And then the third model was to have academically integrated grade-level partnerships. That's more like service learning. A second observation coming out of it was that there seemed to be a pattern of activities that moved outward from the individual to the classroom community, to the school community, to the local community. That as schools thought about the arc that they wanted students to go through from pre-K through grade 5, that tended to be a consistent theme. They would kind of start with, as you see there below, personal questions. Who am I? How do I relate to my community, whether that's my classroom or my school or this neighborhood? And that there was this sort of progression, this kind of expanding perspectives approach. I mentioned the three models. So just here's a little bit more detail about what those looked like. So in some schools, we saw this whole division community partnership where there was one partnership for the school. Students, each grade sort of accessed different kinds of opportunities with that partner. They would visit the partner multiple times a year. Each grade had a different topic, and in-class learning related to the themes of identity and self and moving outward into community. The second model, which I'll describe as co-curricular. I had kind of a hard time thinking of the right word to use for this, but so let me just explain it quickly. The distinction I'm trying to draw that really came through in the data is that there were some schools that really tried to tie the service experiences to what we would think of as core academic courses. So, languages, math, social science, history. And then there were other schools that either didn't tie it to academic learning or tied it to electives or other kinds of less structured learning that wasn't in the core academic focus of the school, but was sometimes structured either there was some preparation, there was some reflection, or maybe it was an elective that students took, a leadership class or an ethics class or a class on inequality or something that was sort of separate from the core academics of the school. And so I'll describe that at different points as co-curricular, and that's what I mean by that. So the second model was co-curricular grade level partnership. So in this model, each grade would have a theme. Let's say you're in second grade and your theme is migration. And so your partnership is focused on migration. Service learning is not integrated into the curriculum. The partner interactions a few times a year during school hours. And it's often squeezed into classroom time or grade level meetings. And then the third model were these academically integrated grade level partnerships where each grade had one partner. The service learning was integrated into the core academic courses. Partner interactions, handful of time during the year, often not client interfacing. And that's one of the challenges I think that happens in lower school. There's kind of two sides of this. One, partners are often more hesitant to work with lower school students because they're really young, and that isn't appropriate in a number of settings. And so you have to be a bit creative about what lower school student involvement looks like there. And so one consequence of that is that there are often you'd be involved, let's say you're involved with an agency that works with low-income families. It's unlikely that it would be appropriate to have lower school students working directly with clients, but they could be working in the background on things that are supporting those clients. And so they need to think creatively about appropriate ways to involve those students. And then lastly, in the academically integrated model, teachers were really the leads on designing it because the service experiences were embedded within the core academics. It couldn't be something that, say, a service learning coordinator for the school did, because really the teachers had to own it because they needed to bring it back in. So that came with a cost, right? It required more of the teachers. The first couple models could be accomplished in a lighter touch way for the teachers. They could just plug into it, and it was a little bit easier on them. So I mean, I've hinted at some of these, but some quick advantages and disadvantages. So on the whole division community, actually, let me pause and say, I was explaining this to some folks before we started. I find this data really interesting, and so I kept a lot of it on the slides. I'm not going to try to read through all of it. We are going to send out the slides later, and so I didn't want to provide so short a summary that you wouldn't be able to make sense of it. I thought, it may be helpful to you, and so I wanted to include it all, but forgive some of the slides for being text heavy. We won't need to read through all of it. You can review that more closely later. So whole division partnership, some advantages: less time needs to be invested because there's one partnership for the entire division. So that was a very compelling piece. So there was some efficiency there. It was easier for teachers to implement because they could plug into things that were sort of readily established. Disadvantages: it was less likely to tie authentically into the curriculum because it was kind of a one-size-fits-all model. And so unless you had an extremely flexible and kind of multi-dimensional partner, it was unlikely to be the perfect fit for every grade. For co-curricular grade level partnerships, similarly, it lowers the burden on the teachers because there isn't the expectation that they build that service into their core classes. Students are exposed to more partners than they would in the first model because each grade level can come up with a partnership. And the partnerships can be tailored to the interests both of the teaching team and the students. Disadvantages: it tended to be more direct service oriented than service learning, and there was a lack of teacher ownership because there wasn't that tight integration with the curriculum. And then the last one, advantages: can be authentically integrated. It's easier to create age-appropriate engagement opportunities, in large part because of the teacher directedness of it, that the teachers were so involved in kind of owning the structure of it. Disadvantages, though, to that model is that, as I mentioned, it requires a lot of time. And so expecting teachers to be able to do that in addition to the work that they're already doing can be a real stretch for some teaching partners. And I think along with that, the quality of it then really depends on the buy-in of those teachers. So all of us who have worked in schools, you're going to have some folks who are really gung-ho about it, really excited about this opportunity and will make it fantastic. And you have other teachers who aren't going to be as enthusiastic or who don't see the connection or who are just too strapped for time. And so the quality varies when you have that kind of a model as well. So just to give you a sense of kind of what does that arc look like, here's two examples. I'm gonna just read through quickly school 2 there. So in kindergarten, there's a community study. This was a San Francisco school. Partner with Mission Neighborhood Health Center on a bake sale, preparing gift cards and snack bags. Twice a year, they go on site. First grade, understanding differences and building relationships. One semester, once a week, a dancing program with a senior center. Second grade, change makers, worked with the SPCA, which is like an animal rights organization, fundraising and adoption. Third grade, immigration and advocacy, a year-long partnership with the International Rescue Committee. And fourth grade, literacy and mentoring, a year-long partnership with Head Start in Spanish. So it was tied to their Spanish class. So just to give you an example of sort of what the arc looks like in a couple different schools at the lower school level. Okay, let's move over to middle school. So one interesting finding there was that our interviews suggested in many of these schools were K-12. And so you'd have teachers in middle school who were really familiar with what happens in lower school and what happens in upper school. And the interviews were pretty clear that teachers felt like middle school was the most difficult division to integrate service learning, given the developmental stage of students. You have lower school students who are kind of just open to anything, like, if you say we're going to go do something, they're usually pretty game to do it. You have high school students who have a bit more emotional maturity, and so they can handle more complex topics, and you can move them through some really challenging and complicated things. And you have middle school students who are kind of right in the middle of that transition, right? And so they can be more cynical. They may not have the maturity to handle some of the complexities that you're going to be introducing them to. And so it can be a real delicate balance. And so just want to recognize that came through really clearly in the interviews with staff and teachers. And so for all of you who are middle school classroom teachers, hats off to you for all the work that you do. And it's just important to recognize that this is a challenging, I think, developmental stage to engage students in. The 3 models that really came through in the middle schools that we spoke to, similar. The first, direct service, dedicated service days and weeks. So one really common model was to have these big service days. So they would sort of cluster service into maybe, they might do these once or twice a semester, or they might have a whole service week where they do a more immersive experience. Second, these grade level partnerships outside of the curriculum. And then third, again, these academically integrated ones. Activities, unlike primary school or lower school level, activities largely focused on local community issues with service completed during the school day, typically during these dedicated mixed grade service days. The service learning deepens the earlier mindset development. So one of the key things that we saw in the lower school interviews was that there was a lot of focus on mindset, on sort of helping students to sort of come at service with an appropriate mindset. In middle school, that deepens, but also introduces students or starts to introduce students to the complexity of issues and the organizations leading change. We've talked about some of the pros and cons of the co-curricular versus academic. That's kind of similar for this, but I will just mention quickly the sort of pros and cons of service days and service weeks. So because for many, I think K-12 teachers, that's really the only place that it can fit, because it's hard to interrupt bell schedules. It's hard to sort of complicate that during the day when you may only have a 30 or 45-minute period. There's no way to get students off campus and do something. And so service days and service weeks tend to be a really common approach to that. So in service days, a handful of volunteer service experiences per year, or say one full school day per semester, typically by whole division or at least by grade level. Some, and I think they should include some context setting, but it's often not integrated into the academic curriculum. It does provide some exposure to diverse organizations, and it can be thematic. And so if there's a theme associated with a particular year, that can be a nice way to deepen students' engagement in that. Some of the implications of that, the partnerships are not necessarily deep or consistent. If sequenced and structured into the curriculum, it can allow for that context setting and reflection. And it may require dedicated staff or volunteers to manage, because getting all the students, say if you did an entire division, out for a week is a pretty heavy lift. And so it may require additional staff. and brings some logistical challenges. How do you get them there? How do you get them back? What do you do for lunch? It's not a small thing to do. Service weeks, similarly, emphasis on context setting and issue and learning and inspiration tends to happen that when you have a full week, there's usually more of a buildup in terms of how you prepare students, which is, I think, really valuable. It has the benefit of being immersive. So rather than kind of just dipping into a particular service site and then out after a few hours, you're spending really quality time over the course of a week, and that can be more impactful for the students. It can be difficult, of course, for schools to devote an entire week. So sometimes that's just too much time for us to be able to set aside. And it does require intense planning and preparation. I'm going to skip these two just in the interest of time because they're fairly similar to the kind of description, implications, pros and cons. And let me just share a couple middle school examples of what this looks like. So I'll look at, let's look at School 3. So School 3, an academically integrated grade level partnership model, one type of community partner per grade, but it can be multiple. This school visits partners 4 times per year, 5th and 6th grade done through science and humanities, 7th grade, they choose their own issue, and 8th grade ties service into trip to Native American communities. Focus on context, on reflection is done in class in relation to the curriculum of the class. And in-field service through all school service days. So these are all days that they take 4 of those days per year. So that's sort of one model of what that looks like. One thing just to flag there on grade 7, where students choose their own issue, there's a lot of kind of debate in the literature in K-12 service learning about the extent to which there should be student voice and agency in deciding and sort of making decisions about the kinds of projects that you engage students in. It's easier to imagine that at the high school level, and there's sort of structured ways of doing that. At the middle school level, as I mentioned before, it's difficult to both get students to a place where they have the kind of perspective needed to understand what might be some good places for them to plug in. But to the extent we can, and where you see that's possible, there are huge advantages to giving students more agency and more choice in deciding what topics and partners to work with. So if that's possible in your own context, most folks agree that that's really advantageous. And high school, okay. So high schools, as you can imagine, use a very wide range of approaches to service, including curricular and co-curricular programs. In terms of co-curricular programming, most high schools offer support for student internships, for international service trips, and student-led clubs. Most high schools, and this was interesting to us, have moved away from required service hours. That's often, we find that really commonly, and we find it commonly in higher ed in the US as well, that one approach that schools often take is to require a certain set of hours. But it was interesting to find that at least in the K-12 schools we were speaking to, many of them had those required hours and were moving away from it. And we're trying to replace that with expectations around student learning and other kinds of authentic outcomes for them that weren't tied to specific hours, because there are some downsides, as I think anyone here who works in an institution that requires a set of hours is probably very clear of what the downsides are to that. It can really sap the kind of intrinsic motivation that we want students to have, because they end up trying to count their hours rather than having an impact. And so we found some schools really trying to find alternative ways to incentivize students to be involved. Most interestingly in high school, most followed a similar pattern. I described in lower school how there was this sort of expanding sense of community from individual to class to school to neighborhood. In high school, the arc that we saw pretty consistently was 9th grade is kind of an internal learning year, similar to the lower school approach, the kind of who am I and who are we. 10th grade as kind of an introduction to local communities and issues with some exposure opportunities kind of layered in. And then 11th and 12th is really where there was more deeper engagement. And some of that happened through the co-curricular things like internships or volunteering, but also some of it happened through really robust service learning programs. The strongest programs, or the folks who felt like their programs were really operating well, were ones that really connected the service that students were involved in to the school's sense of mission and identity. I had the privilege of speaking to a group of folks at University of Santo Tomas, and Dr. Aguilar is on the call. And one of the things that I mentioned to them that was so impressive to me about the university was just how clear their sense of purpose was. Their mission was clear, the connectivity to service learning was clear. And similarly at the high school level, that to the extent that we as teachers can anchor the work that we do to the mission of the school, that creates a sense of cohesion for students where they sort of understand that this is not just sort of something that is one particular teacher's interest. This is kind of who we are and what we do. And that is a really powerful part of how we engage our students in that. So to the extent that you can anchor it that way, I'd encourage it because that's really effective. There's a tension between the demands for academic preparation for college and a desire to engage students in service learning. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. So especially as students get kind of towards the place where they're going to be applying to colleges, there's a lot of scrutiny about anything that would kind of distract from students being able to really showcase their academic skills and knowledge for college admissions. And so this requires teachers to be really careful about how they make the case for service learning as something that adds value to, not distracts from the core academic mission of the school. And lastly, class-based service learning, the folks acknowledged, was just very teacher dependent. And so it required a lot of training and support. And so for any, for folks who are in more of an administrator kind of school level position, to think about is how do you create the capacity for teachers to really plan high quality service learning, recognizing the additional time that that will take. So those are some kind of takeaways. I'm not going to go through much of this, so I'll leave this to your happy reading when you get the slide deck. But as I mentioned, high schools use a wide range of models, and here are some of them. The mandatory service, disciplinary or academic-based, community service days, deep partnership model, which I found interesting, and you can read a little bit more about that, internships, international service, and upper level capstone. So you can see a little bit more about what that looks like. Okay, and then just lastly, just kind of a few quick examples like we did with the other divisions, a few schools and kind of how they approached it. So if you look at school one on the left, as I mentioned, that kind of arc from 9th through 12th, 9th grade really focused on issue exposure, sort of helping students come to understand who they are and who we are as a community, moving into direct service that exposes them to a range of different kinds of service contexts, and then asking them to go deeper in 11th and 12th by enrolling in a service learning academic course or designing an independent study or working as an intern or co-developing and co-teaching a 9th grade workshop. So there's sort of different ways for students to move towards a level of expertise and leadership around service learning and that kind of a model. Okay, so moving from examples of implementation into your own context. So how might these inform your own thinking? So for teachers at the classroom level, consider how this fits into the context of your own teaching as a component of a core academic course or in your role as an advisor. Seek out a project partner that fits your academic focus, that meets a community identified need and engages student interest. Attend preparation and developing a service mindset, and integrate reflection. Those are kind of some starting points. And leverage existing resources like these. So I set up a little bit.ly link that you'll see there. I put a bunch of resources that I find helpful, and I hope you do too. You should be able to access them and download them. They're from the National Youth Leadership Council, which has done great work in K-12 service learning, including, I wanted to share this quickly with you, developing a set of K-12 service learning standards. Now, with all standards, this is made with a very particular purpose in mind, very US focused. Take what's helpful, leave what's not. But for me as a teacher, I always found it helpful to kind of have some North Star to feel like I was kind of navigating the right direction. And so if these standards help you to identify sort of what high quality service learning might look like for you, I just wanted to lift those up because I think they're pretty well done and they're all really based on strong research. So take a look at that. And there are worksheets in that bit.ly link. Here, I'll go back to it just so you can see it again in case you were trying to write it down. There's some great resources from the NYLC that have things like worksheets to help you as a teacher think about, what are the steps I should take to identify a good partner? How can I link to the academic curriculum? How do I prepare students? What are some reflection ideas? So if that's kind of where you're coming into this, please make good use of those resources. For teaching teams and administrators, kind of you're approaching this at the school level. Many of the K-12 schools we interviewed created this sort of school or division-wide service learning program that were really sequenced across grades. And so, for our teachers who really have to think at the level of the classroom, for our teams and administrators who have the opportunity to think at the level of the school, to think about sort of what is the arc that you want your students to go through as they move through your division, and how can service be an anchor of that? As I mentioned, the strongest programs are really tightly aligned to the school's mission. In And especially in the lower school, but also sort of spiraling through middle and high school, there's attention to kind of service as a mindset or an ethic. And so that may be something that you can help to encourage, and to really think carefully about the capacity. That capacity question came up for many of our schools. Many of them have some kind of service learning coordinator to pick up some of the logistical loads. You might want to kind of think about problem solve around some of that. And then lastly, for our university partners, universities, as I mentioned at the top, play a critical role in supporting K-12 schools, whether through our teacher education programs, through professional development that we offer, or as sponsors for service learning with our own students. So for all of us in higher ed to think about, how can we support our K-12 partners in deepening the service engagements that they involve their students in? What are the ways that we can show up and provide our resources and expertise to support them in that work? And just a few kind of final thoughts before we turn it over for Q&A. Effective service learning can take many forms. And I always want, especially for new practitioners, to feel free to experiment and innovate in this work. And don't feel like you need to go from 0 to 100 in your first year. There's lots of ways to sort of build this in ways that allow you to iterate and develop and deepen over time. As Arthur Ashe said, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. Second, strive for integration with academic learning where you can, as this tends to bring better outcomes for both students and partners. Anchor to your school mission and leverage existing resources and networks. Know that you're a part of a global network of service learning and community engagement practitioners, and there are numerous models and resources to draw from. Grace gave a great plug for one of those, which is our IR-SLICE International Association for Service Learning and Community Engagement, which has a robust group of K-12 practitioners who are in our association. Dr. Chan, who's also on the call, is another board member. So please join us. If these kinds of talks are things you're interested in, you can connect with other folks around the world who are also engaged in this work. And that's it. I think we have 10 minutes, and Grace mentioned the question function. So I will stop sharing and we can turn it over for some Q&A and conversation. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Terra, for that very informative and very useful talk. Yeah, I was recognizing so much of what we were doing, even at the higher ed level, in there. And I think that that's one thing that I really want to remind teachers. We at PolyU, we have had 10 plus years to get to where we are, right? Just as Luke says, feel free to experiment, build things up. Don't feel the need to get from 0 to 100 in in one step, because it's not going to happen. And I don't want people to feel intimidated by what they see, what we are doing. Please always be mindful. It took us a while to get there, right? So it's okay if you're taking baby steps, right? There is a question. There's a question on the platform, and Luke. And I think that this is one of those questions where basically there's not going to be a definitive answer. Should service learning be a separate subject, or should it be a module associated with different academic subjects? We hear this all the time. Luke, I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is there are lots of ways to do really good and effective work with our students. And so if what is available to you is building it into a non-required elective course, do it, run with it, make it fantastic. I do think, just as in the higher ed landscape, in the K-12 landscape, the more we can connect and build this and integrate service into core academic work that students do, the better. And that's for a few reasons. One is it adds authenticity to our core academic work. I think it's important for us as practitioners to really give voice to what the evidence tells us, which is that students learn more and more deeply and in more more complete ways when they have opportunities not just to learn content, but to apply it to authentic and real challenges. And service learning provides a way of doing that. It's not the only way, but it's a really effective way. And so to the extent that we can build service into the core academic work, I think it's both to our advantage as practitioners, it's to our students' advantage in terms of their learning, and it helps our community partners as well. That said, there are limits to how much and how often we can do that. And so I think there's always a role for having specific service learning courses that are just really focused on that. And I'd call out particular kinds of institutions for whom that's particularly relevant, say our religious institutions. So if you're a school, a religious school where religious formation is not really part of the core academic work, but really is a key part of what you want to do with your students, service is often going to be or should be a really core part of that. And that's all to the good. So it's, I think there's lots of good ways to do this work, but I always encourage our faculty at Stanford that don't just include service in the elective courses in your major, include it in the requirements, make it a part of what every student in your major is required to do, because that signals that service is a core part of the academic enterprise in your major, in your department. And I think that's a valuable thing to do.
Wow. Yeah, I fully agree. You said earlier that the strongest programs connect to the school mission and the identity. And one of the things that at PolyU we are very strong is what does it mean to be a PolyU graduate? And social responsibility is part of it. So therefore, service is a part of it, right? But having said that, I think a lot of times, and this is me speaking. For us as teachers, we have to work with whatever we are given, right? Not all of us are going to be in a position to dictate certain school policy. So, as Dr. Terra was saying, whatever you have, work with it and believe in it, I think, yeah. There's a question for middle school. Can you share about the impact that middle school students can realistically make on organizations, right? And are there any cons on this? Yeah.
Yeah, they can. Middle schoolers are really capable, and so I know I signaled just some of the challenges of working with that population, but I know as any middle school teacher will tell you, because they tend to be pretty protective and defensive of their middle school students. Middle school students are really highly capable. And so there's a lot that they can do. And it ties well, I think, into the middle school curriculum. So just to give you kind of a couple examples. Middle school students could take an environmental survey of a particular area and do a really rigorous analysis of what kinds of invasive species are in a particular sector of a park, for example, and report that back to the park service so that they know what's there and what's not. Middle school students could develop a student outreach plan for a youth serving organization who are trying to reach middle school students like them and help them think about what kinds of programming would be effective and they would respond to. There's a lot that I think middle schoolers can do. Often I think we underestimate more than overestimate the skills and capabilities of our students if we are careful about sort of setting up a good opportunity and a good partner with them. As far as cons go, there are definitely some potential pitfalls there. One of them is that, as I mentioned, middle school students they're at a stage often, at least, in my experience with middle school students, where they're trying to figure things out, and they're trying to sort of push back against structures that they're only becoming aware of. And so we have to be careful about ways that we guide that don't backfire on us by only increasing levels of cynicism for our middle school students, which they're already kind of prone to. And for any of us who have been involved in, social change work, there's plenty of cynics out there already. And so we have to be careful to make sure that we're providing opportunities for success for them, that they're able to have experiences where they can show progress and show impact. Because if they don't, then they can get jaded about the whole enterprise. And so we do want to be careful to sort of set them up for success in the work that we want to do with them. My dog is next to me, and evidently she agrees with everything I just said. If you're hearing her talk to us in the background.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. Yeah. I think we see that as well. Students have a tendency to be very cynical these days with all the information that's out there. And I think that's something not just for middle school, but even in high school and university, is something that we need to guard against, or we try to counteract as well. So I think we have time for one last question. Can you give us some examples of how K-12 could be conducting service learning online instead of face-to-face?
Oh, that's a great question. we did a few months ago, we did a great session on online virtual engagements. There is actually one of the things that I think we've been really pleasantly surprised by at Stanford was um, how well some service experiences in classes could translate virtually. I think we feared that as we all moved remotely, that would just significantly curtail the service opportunities that students had. But in our experience, we were able to really creatively come up with some good ways to do that. So let me think of a few examples. I mean, so one area of work that students sometimes get, that we want to get our students involved in, is around public policy issues. So that could be sort of an understanding of sort of who's responsible for, whatever, fill in the blank. Keeping parks clean, capturing and rehoming stray animals, whatever the kind of need or challenges that students sort of perceive in the communities around them. And some of the kind of work that we would engage students in, of both learning about sort of who makes decisions and has authority over what kinds of aspects of public life, what policies are currently in place that should address the challenges that you see in the communities around you, and how citizens like them can sort of take action to help encourage better public policies that address those needs, are things that work just as well virtually as they do in person. They can study up on what public policies exist. The city council meetings, at least in our context, are all online now, so they can just hop onto a city council meeting. It's a lot easier than showing up at City Hall to do it, because they often go late into the night. So there are things like that I would say are really doable. We have had some success even with doing things that we thought could only be done in person, like tutoring online. And that's been really effective. And so some of our partners, like the Boys and Girls Clubs, which is an after-school youth serving organization, have worked with us to set up Zoom tutoring sessions where their students can just do drop-ins, and we have our students sort of on call, ready to kind of drop in and tutor students. So I think some of the things that we would normally think would require a lot of face-to-face can still be accomplished virtually. And then the last thing is that I'd say is we have, a number of our students will do things like they'll do surveys, like let's say there's an organization that's trying to figure out what their clients think about X, Y, or Z, or they're trying to figure out what a sample of a population of a particular neighborhood feels about something. That's also something that can be done really effectively virtually through email, by sending postcards around, by collecting things. So I think there's ways that we can try to think creatively about the kinds of projects we would engage our students, and then find a kind of virtual version of that. One of the things that really helps in K-12 is that one of the biggest barriers to service learning in K-12 is just logistics. How do you get students off campus? That can be really hard. That can just be a deal breaker. And so even when we get back to in-person service experiences, I think it's to our advantage to think about how we can leverage virtual engagements, because it can help us transcend that distance that can sometimes be a real barrier to us engaging our students.
Wow. Yeah, so absolutely. I'm a technology person, and but I think that I think that there is something in there that I think all of us as teachers, we should be thinking about all of this technology, all of these advancements in technology and online communications that were catalyzed by COVID. We shouldn't just let this be, a stopgap, right? We should think about how we continue to leverage this even post-COVID. So I think we are kind of running up against the time because we have the other workshops that are about to begin, and actually I need to go and do one of the workshops. So let us thank Dr. Terra again. And may I also ask a favor? We are going to be putting up a feedback form link right here. Okay, I hope that the feedback form link is here. So please do take the time, okay, to give us some feedback. We really do need to know what you think, and we really welcome the feedback, right? And also, again, if you haven't had the chance to take a look at the virtual world yet, please do that. It gives an immersive experience of our flagship projects. And also, there are lots of multimedia exhibits on there. And again, also, please do take the time. There are also comment boxes and bulletin boards on there, please take the time to leave us some comments and some feedback, right? As I was saying yesterday, this is the first time that we are doing this, and we really want to know how well this works. So the rest of the for the rest of the symposium, workshops G, H, and I are just about starting. The virtual expo is running in parallel, and then our last of the talks by Mr. Dion Chan, a principal of YMCA Hong Kong Christian College, it will start at 1:30 p.m. Hong Kong time, and then afterwards we will have our award ceremony and closing. So thank you very much again. Thank you, Dr. Terra. Thank you to all participants. I hope that you have a good day and enjoy the rest of the symposium. Thank you.